Hello to everyone here tonight. Hello, hello, and welcome to Five Things I've Learned About America tonight with Alan Light, a wonderful friend, and much more significantly tonight, uh, leading music journalist, broadcaster, author of an amazing series of books. Joining us here tonight at the America series. This is a joint series of My 5 Things and our pro-democracy media platform, Resolute Square. I'm Megan Matson. I'm a co-founder of Resolute Square, and so delighted to be here with Alan this evening. So, Alan, I just, as part of diving in, you chose five giants of American music. I'm interested first to talk about why you chose them.
Yep.
And then, as part of that, I think you said something so framing of this. The ideals these musicians represent, their ambitions and achievements, offer us all an opportunity to better understand each other and some models to move forward as listeners and as citizens. So can you just give an overview of the musicians you selected?
Sure. Megan, thank you. And in the interest of full disclosure, as you said, we should probably say we know each other from a previous lifetime.
Yes, we are
We are
fortunate.
we are fortunate to be friends from college and beyond. So all the more reason that I'm happy to be here to support, and really honored to be among the series that you've put together. And those who don't know should go and look at some of the other folks you've had on here who are far more accomplished and esteemed than I am, and worth your time and attention. And I think when you approached me with the idea of doing this, the thing that I struggled with a little bit was, though I was an American Studies major at school when I first met and knew you, and the relationship between American music, American culture, and so the different strains of American history have long fascinated me. To think about how to present within sort of the context of what you guys are doing, how to isolate when you're talking about music. So much of it is a global thing, more so now than ever before. So to talk about music and technology, or music and communication, or those sorts of things, how to sort of put that within just the American lens and the American framework was what I was struggling with a little bit. And so we hit on this idea of finding, what we settled on were five musicians, all of whom I have either worked with, pretty closely, or written about at some length. These are people that I've written books about, or interviewed, or spent time with, or worked with, who exemplify, I think, different things about music and America, whether that be what the ambitions and aspirations are in, on a big canvas, whether that be about music and one-to-one communication, artists who represent the complications of thinking about music in America, thinking about category and genre, and the ways that we often define or limit the way we talk about and think about music. And so each of these was some piece of, I think, this story of music in America, in a way that I had grappled with up close enough to feel like I had something to say about it. So that's where we landed on this list. You want to run down the
Yeah,
folks that we want to focus on?
yeah, as I was saying, we could do 6 semesters on this survey course. And I think you really teed up the first of the five: Nina Simone, Johnny Cash, Prince, Public Enemy, and Taylor Swift. And I think, what you were just saying about each piece of American music is so much more complex than you might see. And that's really what you were highlighting with Nina Simone. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think wanting to start with Nina Simone, and I didn't know or work with Nina Simone, but I did write a book that came out of the documentary What Happened Miss Simone that I hope people saw. Was Oscar nominated a few years back, and really a remarkable film. And just the short version on that book was the producers of the film came to me and said, we unearthed all this incredible research and archive and material, and about this much of it makes its way to the screen. I mean, what you're able to do in a 100 minutes of a film barely touches all of these things that we found: her diaries and her interview transcripts and the raw manuscripts for her memoir and all of this stuff. And so they gave that to me with the idea of kind of fleshing out the story that they had put on screen, to sort of dig deeper into all of this material. And I think that, I'm certainly thinking about Nina Simone a lot recently around a lot of the conversation that surrounded this latest Beyonce album, which was initially laid up as Beyonce's country album, which is not really what it is, but certainly it's Beyonce presenting this kind of examination of American music in a way, or certainly a big chunk of American music, and looking at what are the reasons that we make these categories, that we make these genres, who's allowed to make what kind of music, why do we think it's weird that somebody who looks like this makes a sound that's like this over here. And these were all things that were really, really central when you're talking about the very complicated career and very complicated life of Nina Simone. Initially, the aspiration for Nina was to be a classical pianist, was to be, essentially the first Black woman to attain, concert, the heights of classical concert pianist. Everything was trained that way. She grew up in a small town where literally they took collection from everybody in town to raise enough money to send her to away to a school where she could study music. Everything was focused that she was going to go to conservatory, that she was going to study and become this acclaimed classical pianist. She auditioned for the Curtis School of Music in Philadelphia. She was not accepted. She believed to her dying day that she was not accepted because of her race. And if you actually look, it is, like everything else, a little more complicated than that, because there were actually Black students who were at Curtis. She wouldn't have been the first or the only one. And so, who knows? The point of that was what she believed had happened. And that was what she carried for the rest of her life. And she had to really reorient herself, and started playing piano in a bar in Atlantic City. The owner of the bar was like, okay, that's fine, but when are you going to sing? She's like, well, I've never sung before, but she started singing in the second set, or else she was going to get fired, and sort of carved out this lane where she became this extraordinary singer, extraordinary interpretive singer, remarkable musician, but worked with music that was never predictable. I mean, this was somebody who did, Hebrew folk songs, Beatles covers, old blues songs, old, sort of slave songs and ring games, Leonard Cohen songs, songs from Broadway, this incredibly expansive thing. And then the problem was, what do you call that? What do you do with that? What category? Where do you put it in the record store? I mean, very literally, in a music retail environment that is structured, that something goes in a category. And she didn't like any of the labels. She didn't like when people called her a jazz artist. She said, you're only calling me that because I'm Black. What I do is not jazz. It's not improvisational in that way. That's not what I do. What she did was this entirely unique survey of any sort of music that spoke to her. Folk music, soul music, whatever it is. And it was this, huge limitation on her career. She would look around and say, why is Aretha Franklin or Dionne Warwick or Nancy Wilson or all these other people, they get to be big stars and play bigger rooms and sell more records, and I don't get to do that. And that was then the next level of her frustration. That then got focused to her political activism, which ultimately became sort of the final frontier of her frustration, that ultimately combined with her own, emotional, personal issues and everything else, is, most folks know, leads to this sort of breakdown later in her life and this, very tragic extended period in her career before sort of a rediscovery at the end. So this idea of category, this idea of Beyonce saying people won't let me make a country record, that is not a new thing. Not to take anything away from a fantastic Beyonce record, but this idea that American music is always more complicated than you think it is. That any time that you think, oh, country music means this thing, or R&B means this thing over here, or jazz, none of those things actually stand up to more scrutiny or any kind of rules and parameters that you try to put around them.
Well, I'm so interested across all of these artists, and with Nina Simone, one, their personal struggles. So her drive to perfect herself as a classical musician,
Right.
and have people sit quietly and listen to her, and where that headed. And
right. And then expecting people were going to sit quietly and listen to her in a nightclub. And then if they didn't, get angry and storm off. Like, what are the different sort of clashes of, and I think that the whole, the thing that's going to come up a lot talking about all of these artists is sort of, what are our expectations around music, around American music, but around any music? Like, what is it that we're bringing that, what do we want it to be doing? And how does that connect to what they actually want to be doing?
She has that amazing lyric, talk real fine, just like a lady, and you'd stop calling me Sister Sadie. Oh, but this whole country is full of lies. For anyone else on this, in this class, who's as dumb as I am, I had never heard Mississippi Goddamn until I read your book. How is that not?
Think about how extraordinary. I mean, this is before anybody's doing anything like this. There are some, and this is part of looking around and saying, okay, these white folk singers are able to talk about issues and talk about things, but nobody, not even Dylan, not even, Pete Seeger, whoever was doing protest music in that folk revival in the early 60s, nobody was writing anything as direct and, not hiding behind any sort of metaphor or poetry or anything, but coming straight at it, and with a song that sounds like sounds like something out of musical theater, right?
It's amazing. It's sort of like the Get Out, the power of the Get Out message within that horror movie format, and then what she does with that. Anyway, I urge everyone to go listen to Mississippi Goddamn and Baltimore. So when that personal struggle then ends up really running into the political moments of their time, can you talk about what really hit her with the Birmingham bombing and then her proximity to Malcolm X?
Yeah, I think that in the case of that song, that was a very specific reaction to many, many things that are happening as the civil rights movement is gathering force and momentum. But the bombing of the church in Birmingham that left 4 girls dead in the rubble, which also inspired John Coltrane's incredible composition Alabama. That was the spark for writing Mississippi Goddamn. She had never written a song before. I mean, that's,
that was her first song.
That was her first song, or certainly her first full attempt at writing a song, because she just said, I just have to say what I have to say about this. And it led her to, proximity, as you said. She sang at Selma, at the march. Of course, when she met Martin Luther King, the first thing she said to him was, I just want you to know, Dr. King, that I am not nonviolent. He sort of said, okay, we'll work with what we got. But she built a much closer relationship to Malcolm X, and then in turn to sort of the Black Power figures, the Panthers and the Black Power movement, and really kind of she had put all her chips first on this classical career and lost that hand. And then she sort of put all her chips on, on radical politics. And as those different leaders were assassinated, arrested, run out of the country, or, sort of scared off by all of that, and she sort of felt like she was holding the bag and still fighting for something that really was feeling less and less like a movement. That was really the thing that, was the end of the road for her. I mean, she leaves America, she moves to Africa. That works for a while until it doesn't. She kicks around Europe. There are literally phases where it's unclear where she's living. There are months where she sort of drops off the map. And, happily at the end, there's a little bit of reconciliation with her daughter and a bit of a, structure around her to take care of her, and playing, bigger and more appropriate kinds of shows for her after a dark period that follows. But that really was the result of this sense that if the music isn't gonna turn out to be what I wanted it to be, and if the political movement isn't going to turn out to be what I hoped that it would be, what am I doing? What have I got? And facing a really difficult period coming out of that.
Yeah. Her other lyric, just hound dogs on my trail, school children sitting in jail, Lord have mercy on this land of mine. And then her feeling that it's the artist's duty to reflect the time.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. I think if anybody knows anything about Nina Simone at this point, sort of that quote, that I feel that it's an artist's duty to reflect the times, is so widely quoted and circulated. And I depending exactly how you read that quote, I struggle with it a little bit, as we will probably come up as we talk about some of these other musicians, is how much an artist inevitably reflects anything that you do reflects the time, whatever that is, however much it's just a dumb pop song, whatever it is that you're doing, in some way that's about the time and place that you exist in. And this sense that, or this question around, is there an obligation for artists, for musicians, to speak to issues, to be that active social commentary? I'm certainly not always comfortable saying that's a thing that an artist has to do. If it's a thing that an artist chooses to do, it's fine and it's great. But I think when you spend, I've spent however many decades talking to and being around musicians, talking about them and their work and their ambitions and all that. And people do this for a lot of different reasons. And none of those reasons are bad reasons. Mm-hmm. It's not, I don't think, a better thing if you have that sort of political engagement. I don't think it's a worse thing if you don't. I went this morning and saw there's a new documentary about Brian Eno, the producer, and which is a really interesting film. But he said in there, what he's concluded after all of these, I'm a little stuck on these things. I don't want to get too sidetracked by it. But he said, his interest right now is, why do people like music? Like, start from this. What is the reason that this bunch of notes together is more appealing to you than this other bunch of notes together? Mm-hmm. Like, just what we all know it, we assume it. It's pre-verbal. It's music. Music comes before language in some ways. And what is it? And he talked about music as a means of I'm not going to get his language right, but sort of gathering like-minded people together, that it really is a connector, is what it is. Mm-hmm. And that it's about creating feelings. And he said people don't really like to hear that. They like to hear that it's about like big ideas or big issues. But art is really about whether it's creating, whether it's making you feel something. That's the job. Like, that's in the end what we're talking about. So that quote from Nina Simone of it's the artist's duty to reflect the times. I think the word, it really depends what you take that word reflect to
Right.
mean.
Right. Well, I was wondering, I mean, throughout the arc of these artists, what was your takeaway from Nina Simone and America? Would she have had a different experience in a different time with her artistic impulse?
I mean, I think the only thing that I think is dramatically different, I mean, Nina Simone would be a different sort of a figure in a post hip hop world for sure. And she would be a different sort of a figure today in a playlist world, in a streaming world, where those ideas of genre and category are really falling apart, more and more every single day. I don't think that kids listen to music the way that we did,
Right.
where it is tribal, where it is an identifier, where it is, your clan is the music that you listen to, and this kind is, I'm over here, I listen to metal and I don't listen to that hip hop stuff, or I don't, I just don't, I don't think that's how kids listen now. I think in a shuffle, universe, those lines have all really blurred. Certainly the way that music is made has really blurred, the way that, these things actually, again, once you start to say, what is, if you look at the charts, a country song, a pop song, a hip hop song, they're all just next to each other. So I think that those things would reframe a figure like Nina Simone in a different way. But I think a lot of her, it's certainly hard pressed to say that her political frustrations would be any better,
Right.
these decades later.
So moving through our
Yep.
teaser chapters on these, you chose Johnny Cash, and
Okay.
your lesson about America from Johnny Cash was the creative power of an open mind and a generous heart.
Yeah.
And his empathy as part of his artistic genius.
Yeah, I think an interesting follow-up, or how that works as a mirror image to Nina Simone in some ways. So I wrote a book about Johnny Cash, actually
Yes,
for
you did.
the Smithsonian, who did a book. They had a bunch of his artifacts and his stuff, and they wanted a book to sort of frame and tell his story and present all that. I did one interview with Johnny Cash right near the end of his life, when he put out the American Four, the fourth in the series with Rick Rubin, which was the album that had his cover of Hurt, the Nine Inch Nails song that became the phenomenon that it became. And spending time, thinking about Johnny Cash and talking about him, this notion of using your work to create and foster empathy, I mean, that's become such a word, such a term now. But that was the project that I really believe this guy was engaged in. And the most obvious thing is just to look at a song like Man in Black and say, this was a guy who was just singing about, here's the struggle that all of these people, old people, young people, poor people, people of faith, people not of faith. I can't, I'm not going to wear bright colors and celebrate and be happy because I see the trauma that all of these other communities are undergoing, and I want to take on my responsibility for that. It's an astonishing statement to do that, and an astonishing statement to do that at a moment where, in the riven world that we are in, society that we are in this incredibly, stratified and polarized world that we're in, the moment that it gets compared to is that late 60s, and it's in that moment that he's doing that song. And the fact that this was a guy who could go, literally from doing a, Bible revival with Billy Graham to going and singing for, folkies and hippies, and not only didn't see the conflict in that, but really saw that his role and his project was to bridge those worlds. It's just an extraordinary thing. And I just, the closer that you look at the work that this guy did, albums that were exploring Native American history, albums that were exploring different parts of American history, a fascination with trains and, the train system, and doing a TV show where he was really attempting to sort of tell the story of American music. I mean, if people haven't gone back and watched those episodes, and they came out on DVD, and you can find them, of the Johnny Cash show that he hosted for a couple of years, where it was him singing with Louis Armstrong, and then with like James Taylor and Linda Ronstadt, and then doing a segment on, the history of trains. And like, the scope is so incredible, and really speaks to, I think, just like the better part of everybody's heart, but certainly the better part of what an artist's heart can be.
I just urge everybody listening again on this one. The Life and Legacy of Johnny Cash by Ellen Light is a revelation. It really is, to read that entire piece. It's amazing what you did.
Thank you. I mean, it's hard. Look, the guy wrote multiple memoirs, and they're very good. And there's much more comprehensive biographies. There's a great one that Robert Hilburn did. This is more a sort of quick survey that I did with lots of photos and illustrations and stuff. But it was certainly a really rewarding thing for me to dig into that life and dig into his writings, and to think about, the dots that he was connecting musically, culturally, spiritually in that work.
Yeah, I mean, he does feel, as you're saying, like a model we could all look to for bridging and reaching through just that real generosity of spirit.
When Johnny Cash died, Bob Dylan wrote, among other things, but he wrote a tribute that said Johnny Cash is the North Star. And, there's a lot to be said. If that was what you said as your North Star, you could do a lot worse.
Yeah.
Than following that example.
I pulled you had quoted Dylan, truly he is what the land and country are all about, the heart and soul of it personified, and what it means to be here. And I just didn't have that awareness of his, what he called concept albums, that you really dig into through the 60s, into the 70s, and how quietly he was playing at prisons long before, like in the decade before.
Right. Folsom. Yeah, when he did Folsom, that was not a novelty thing for him. No. And it was, in fact, at a dip in his career when he felt that those performances would sort of deliver the truest version of himself. Mm-hmm. That would actually document much more where his head and his heart were at that time. So, again, to bounce back off that Nina Simone quote, I mean, he certainly, there are many ways he was reflecting his time, but he was also so deeply engaged in this sense of American history and American promise and potential, and really trying to see what, how to try to move the country towards living up to these ideals that it had set. I mean, that's where you see the Cash legacy in somebody like a Springsteen.
Yeah.
Right? Is this idea that there is, there was this foundational philosophy, in the documents, in the things that the country was built on, and how can we, push ourselves toward those ideas, and how can we use music and communication and gathering an audience to raise those questions.
Well, I love, again, with him as a North Star, just the way you put this: consistent use of his platform to give a voice to the voiceless, led not by dogma, but by simple human decency. Because I think it feels like a lot of good human behavior right now is very prescriptive and dogmatic, and is not coming from it. So that there's a politically correct superstructure of good behavior that is not coming from a fundamental human decency or empathy.
There was no
intellectualized and politicized. And so I love that you said that about Cash.
Yeah, I think there is no sense of a purity test around. I mean, that's where his interest in reaching out to prisoners, reaching out to, those who were, this is somebody who would say those who were damaged, one way or another, or struggling one way or another, were very clearly the top of his mind. And, not to make too much, I mean, I think that the later albums, the things that he did with Rick Rubin, the exploration of old and new music, doing doing Delia's Gone and these, traditional murder ballads, and then doing a Soundgarden song, and, looking at all of this stuff. That was he was open to all of that, and didn't always immediately understand songs that Rick was bringing to him, but said, let me see if I hear what you hear, would that gives me a space to enter this song. And that Nine Inch Nails, that cover of Hurt, as we all know, is, and then of course that, the music video that follows, we've had some great last acts. I mean, David Bowie did an amazing final act, putting out the Black Star album the weekend that he passed, and getting to make that statement. Leonard Cohen got to make a final statement with the You Want It Darker album, knowing that his days were numbered. The model for that, and an untouchable version, is Cash finding that in that Trent Reznor song, and creating this incredibly unsentimental, very profound look at mortality that nobody could see. You couldn't ever anticipate finding that.
Yeah, one was struck, Cash describing Rick Rubin as comparable to Sam Phillips in terms of just having a vision for where, especially with that Hurt piece and Rusty Cage. Your description of the Hurt video was so moving, as just the essence of an artist, in that everyone else who watched it, his family and even Rick Rubin, they were wrecked. And his son described him like a kid. He was
Right.
so delighted because of the art of it.
Right.
And I guess, can you talk about that? Because it felt a lot like some of your observations in the article on the Tortured Poets Department, and then just writing and the true artist.
Yeah, I mean, that, as you said, there's the emotion of what that project was. This is incredible. Obviously, the vision that Mark Romanek as the director brought to that, and the concept for it, are, there's not enough that can be said about that. But from all accounts, Cash threw himself into it, was sort of like, what else can I do? When he takes the bottle of wine and he spills it over the table. They said he had the greatest time doing that. He's like, yeah, I want to, this is about this kind of, finality and destruction in a way, and sweeping away the legacy. It's just such a, the ability to look at that moment as clear-eyed, and to say, I can make a statement out of this. I can make, something that's not sentimental, not just, we're going to do this because it's going to tug at the heartstrings, but it's really, I'll go back to Brian Eno saying that art is about making you feel. That is a thing that gives you feelings. Like, that's, a grand slam of that.
So with Cash, I mean, everything about his work and who he is seems imbued with the sort of landscape of America and the people of America. Do you think there's anything particular to American liberty and the sense of individual liberty that benefits these artists?
One thing that I think is really interesting to think about in the Cash story is, not to get too deep in the weeds, you can look into it as you want to, but I'm sure you picked up on and were fascinated by this community that he was raised in, and this sort of post-depression near socialist commune experiment
Yeah.
that his family, moved to in Arkansas, and were given, a bare and overgrown plot of land, and there was a planned community with a central general store, gas station, movie theater, and this sort of cooperative. I mean, it really is a kind of socialist experiment that was an attempt to figure out how do we get particularly rural communities out of the depths of the Depression. Like, what's going to turn this around? And this was a thing that it wasn't a widespread thing, but there were these examples. And it really does feel like some of those principles were really formative for the rest of Johnny Cash's life. I mean, I don't know how much of that is coincidence, how much of that is just he would have been that person anyway, or it's the family, or it's genetic, like whatever the circumstances are. But I do think it's really telling that he came from this very specific time and place that was very much about how do we as a community together work together, support each other to pull through a time of crisis. That never seems to have gone away. I mean, that really seems to be at the center of how he thought about stuff. And it gets very tangled with, he's a deeply religious guy. The family was from a family of preachers, and he took on that, sort of preacherly aspect to what his work was. It's not distinct from his faith, but that faith was always very directed to this sense of, again, empathy and support, and and helping others and lifting others up in a way that we all know is not what even a pretty fundamentalist religious background can take you.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that, just because he seems also like a route to a true spirituality, or a healthy community-based faith, because so many of his actions in the prisons and with his fight for that Ira Hayes are rooted in I think a pure form of decency and faith. And it gave him such strength after June's death, when he was destroyed, and Reuben said, "Do you have faith?" And he said, "Put me to work or I'll die."
Right.
He's just an astonishing melding of faith and artistry.
But it's not, but the other thing is there was nothing watered down in his faith. I mean, a lot of times when we think about that, we think, well, he wasn't religious, he was spiritual. He wasn't like, with a lot of these kinds of figures, either, perfectly legitimate, but it's sort of like faith is this, more sort of wobbly, conceptual, spiritual, like you take what you want from it. He came from a strict, very serious religious background, and made albums, recorded himself reading the entire New Testament and released that as put that out, made films about traveling in Israel on the path that Jesus took. Like, all of the other stuff, all of the social justice stuff, as powerful as it is, and as, central to his project and to his work as it is, really did exist, not in contrast to, but very much in parallel with what his, very deep religious grounding was.
I have so many more questions on that front. He's interesting in how he intersected at political moments, and I really appreciated your description of him declining Nixon's request to sing Okie from Muskogee and Welfare Cadillac. Because otherwise he wasn't overtly.
Yeah, and an interesting moment, and he had, he was not he sort of prided himself on, he said he didn't vote. He didn't pick sides.
Right.
And he was invited to the White House for a celebration of country music kind of a thing that in the Nixon administration. But they asked him to sing Okie from Muskogee, and they asked him to sing the song Welfare Cadillac that was, you can tell from the title what it was, that was this sort of vilification of welfare. And he said, I'm not doing that. That's, that's not who I am. That's not how I feel. And this was somebody who believed in, you are loyal and faithful to the, American authority. You may or may not like the president. You may or may not be who you want, but you show, you show up for them. You don't challenge that. But that was, that was a bridge too far for him.
Right.
And those are interesting. I mean, again, this notion that it's never as easy as you think it is, right? It's never, you think about somebody like, I don't know where I'm going with this, just that I was thinking about him, but later on, a figure like Toby Keith, who was, sort of veered more wildly between these things, but showed up, was there for a Republican inauguration and a Democratic inauguration. Said in the end, my beliefs are my beliefs. They may line up. Toby Keith said some stupid things and then said some other, was really, he was a registered Democrat, despite the dumb things that he said about the Iraq War and the Dixie Chicks and all of those things, but still showed up for Obama's inauguration because that was still the leader of the country.
Right.
So, those are, again, particularly in that community, I think particularly in the country music world, in the Southern male, all of those things, those play out in fascinating ways. And they do for Johnny Cash. Again, it's very easy to turn him into, liberal activist icon. And he was amazing in all of these ways, and maybe in some ways more amazing than being that. But he wasn't that.
Right. Well, it's exciting to realize that we're in the 40th anniversary summer of Purple Rain. Big year.
And that's our
84.
That's our freshman. That's our high school graduation freshman year right there.
Yep, that little bender. So Prince is your third, and you wrote the book Let's Go Crazy, another great read about a magnificent, complex artist. The lesson drawn there is that the potential and the conflicts between genius, commerce, and technology in America. So this phenomenon of our high school graduation year, 40 years ago this summer. Can you lean into why you selected Prince in this?
Yeah, so I'm a lifelong, he's here over my shoulder always. I'm a lifelong obsessive Prince fan. Without getting too far into it, just discovering him and having that sense of this, it was somebody who was doing everything that I was interested in, who was, doing R&B and rock and funk and pop and, guitar solos and dance rhythms and this crazy, not difficult to pin down sexuality and like everything that was interesting, certainly to adolescent, was all happening in this guy's music. Like it was all there, and it just completely blew my circuitry. And then when Purple Rain happened, I was already a huge fan. And then when Purple Rain happened, obviously, and the world, fully caught on, and he just took that, all the way. That was all I could do or say or think about or talk about. I was very fortunate that later, in my career, that I was able to spend quite a bit of time with Prince, that I was able to be in that orbit, and very few were welcomed into that orbit. I did several big stories with him, and that wasn't just a sort of drop in and do something and go back. It was I spent a lot of days and a lot of travel and time on the road with him and in different countries and lots of things. And we'll never, ever have an experience like that, to sit on the piano bench with him in sound check and, talk to him while he's playing and talking and leading the band. So I wrote the book. I wrote it for the 30th anniversary of Purple Rain. This book, Let's Go Crazy, about the making of that whole project, the film, the music, and also a lot about the culture of 1984, which was a really interesting, fascinating, those of us who lived through it know that, but in retrospect, in some ways, even more so, all of the things that are happening right then that Purple Rain kind of encapsulates and explains or complicates. Spending time around Prince was, I really do believe the only time that I'm going to witness and experience what actual genius is. I mean, we all know an overused word, and but to be with someone who constructed an entire world around himself that was entirely driven by allowing him to create anytime, anywhere, whenever inspiration struck, that if it was 3 o'clock in the morning and you were in Dayton and he had an idea, the band knew the phone might ring, there's a studio on hold, there's an engineer on hold, and we have to go work now. And that was all day, every day. That, anything, just, it was coming through him constantly. There was no turning that off. Being with him on tour and watching him do, 3-hour sound checks, 2.5-hour shows, and then 2-hour after shows at a club, and put his band through, 8 hours a night playing. There's just nothing touched him that he didn't bring in. Everything was constructed to facilitate that sort of creativity. But of course, as we know, the conflict becomes, if you're making music constantly, if you're creating this stuff all the time, now what do you do with it? And he said to me, at some point when I was doing the story, he's like, I make an album, and by the time they're ready to put it out, I've made another album. And by the time they want me to go on tour, I've made another album. So what do they want me to play? And that really became this conflict between him and Warner Brothers Records, and this notion of who determines and who controls how this music goes out in the world. Now, we live in a really different world now than we did. That was in the 90s, when that sort of reached a breaking point for him. In every way, in all of these ways, like in the ability to easily record yourself and the ability to just make records on your own, and you don't need to go book a studio at 3 o'clock in the morning. You can just sit down and do this. And also in all of the ways that music is released and the ways that music was consumed. And he was visionary in a lot of ways. He saw, I could put my music out through the internet. He saw, the fight is about ownership of your masters, your master recordings, and the ability to control what's done with them. The problem was that he was such an absolute control fanatic that he wouldn't let anybody go and do any of this stuff effectively. Like, you'd have the right idea. If you could have handed that to somebody and let them do it, it would have been great. But a lot of that traces back, to bring this full circle, to Purple Rain, because the thing that just flies out of thinking about Purple Rain is it is absolutely insane that movie was made. This was somebody who had like 1.5 hits. Little Red Corvette was a hit. 1999 was kind of a hit. He had just moved up to playing arenas. And he had this idea for a movie, and he went to his managers and he said, "You're going to go get me a deal to make this movie. And if you're not, you're fired, and I'll find somebody who will." And everybody, his band thought he was nuts. His managers thought he was nuts. The studios didn't know what he was talking about. But Warner Brothers kind of said,
it wasn't written. It
It
wasn't
wasn't
written.
written. No, it was like sketches in his notebook that he was carrying around. It was, there's a meeting as described where they pitch this, and the studio executives at one studio say, well, we could do that idea, but maybe we would have John Travolta be the star in the movie. Like that, maybe we could do that. And this was a time when a lot of rock stars were trying to make movies, and none of them were working. I mean, Paul McCartney made Give My Regards to Broad Street. It was a disaster. Paul Simon made One Trick Pony. It was a bomb. Like it wasn't like, oh, it worked to let a musician go make a feature film. Those always work. Like, no, those never work. But when he did it, and when it became what it became, and when he became the first person in history to have a #1 single, album, and movie simultaneously, this was not somebody who was going to let anybody tell him no the rest of his working life.
Yeah. I saw that you made such an interesting comment in your article on Taylor Swift's Tortured Poets Department, that she, in this new world, is accomplishing what Prince envisioned.
Yeah, we can jump to the punchline and do that. Yeah, jump to I do think. Look, I think that the things that I mean, leaving
Not to
aside,
leap into Taylor Swift, but
she's not the musician. She's not the creative force. And I love Taylor, as we'll get to it.
yeah.
She isn't. I'm not saying that musically Taylor is what Prince was, but that sense of control over your career, the fight over her master recordings and doing the re-recordings of her catalog, doing the Taylor's version of all the albums that she doesn't own and doesn't control, putting out an album and then saying, hey, it's the middle of the night, here's a whole other album. All of those, that's the stuff that Prince was talking about, that these are creative decisions, these are artistic decisions, and the artist, should ultimately be the one who determines that. She is sort of the living manifestation of a lot of those issues that he was raising decades ago, which is just a really fascinating thing, that now, that because of her, this notion of writing contracts where your master recordings revert to you, or doing deals where you're essentially licensing your recordings to a label and they'll put them out, but you still own them. Like that's just how it's done now. I mean, that's just common currency now. When he was talking about that in the 90s, people said he was crazy. When he wrote Slave on his face to protest, the fact that he didn't own his own music, people said the guy's lost his mind. I mean, everybody made fun of him. And whatever the tactics were, did he play his cards the right way? That's one conversation. But was he fundamentally talking about something that turned out to all be true? Unarguably so.
Do you, I mean, this is probably a pointless question, but is there an ideal world where you would have heard and seen more success and peace of mind for Prince?
Is there an ideal world? Sure. Did any of us, live in that world? Look, there were a lot of internal struggles for Prince as well.
Right.
This was somebody who sort of simultaneously wanted to be the biggest superstar in the world and a cult artist who could do whatever he wanted and just have his audience follow him. And he had moments where he was both of those things. Purple Rain was both of those things. But really everything, his whole career is turning up and down those dials of, okay, I'm going to sort of go off in the wilderness and make music that I want to make. And then when I get frustrated that there's not enough audience for that, I know how to make the kind of record that people like and will buy, and I can go sell out an arena tour again. Like you can see him hitting those switches over all of those years. And maybe that's the only way that was going to play out. But it was a tension for him.
Yeah.
And a thing that's really, when you look back at Purple Rain, and he was the biggest star in the world. It was the biggest album of the year. It was fighting for that position with Born in the USA. I mean, 1984 is bonkers. 1984 is the
Bonkers.
biggest of everything. 1984 is Purple Rain, Born in the USA, Like a Virgin, Van Halen's 1984, like all these records that sell 8, 10, 12 million copies. It's the Victory Tour. It's Michael Jackson taking his brothers and doing the biggest stadium tour of all time. Like everything, it's the first thing everybody does after Thriller, where there's a whole new sense of scale. It's the first thing everybody does after MTV has really, shown what it can do. And so just everything explodes. But Prince does that for about 6 months. He tours Purple Rain from the fall to 1984 to the spring of 1985 in the US, and he stops. He never toured Purple Rain in Europe. He never took it, Meantime, Springsteen did like 5 laps for Born in the USA, right? He did arenas in the US, then he did arenas in Europe, then he did stadiums in the US, then he did arenas in Australia, then he did stadiums in Europe. Like he worked that thing and grew it and grew it and grew it. And fine, like great, more power to him. But I think Prince saw that. He got to the mountaintop and he saw what it was going to require. And he said, I can't do that. And he cut the tour off dead. And he had a new album that he had Around the World in a Day out 2 weeks later.
Wow.
He put it in the rear view instantly. And I just think he thought, I can't go do this same show for 2 years.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not, I'm already on to the next thing and the thing after that.
That's such a great parallel to, Springsteen's autobiography when he makes that decision about Born in the USA. And he said, I'm going to write the shit out of this. Sorry.
Yeah.
It's going to be big. And
listen, Prince made that decision as well. I mean, Purple Rain was a very intentional
with a
project. And with the way he constructed that band and with putting himself out front and making himself more of a guitar hero, like he set out to conquer the world with that project. It was not an accident. But once he had done that, for Springsteen, that was how big a platform can I make this? How much and how do I utilize that, and getting a sense of the power that comes with that. And none of this is in any way to denigrate what Springsteen chose to do in that moment, but the contrast is so striking.
I know we need to move forward, but what does it say about America I remember the night before a bunch of us friends left for college, we danced all night in the living room in the dark to Purple Rain until we were just laying flat and soaked. Why did it hit the whole country the way it did? Is it back to Brian Eno's, it just felt that good?
I think in some ways, yes. I think in some ways it really was this incredible convergence of a lot of things that were happening. Again, this a new sense of possibility of scale, a new sense of possibility of video and making what essentially a long form feature film out of a video would be. And at a time when there's a lot of really interesting things happening around race in 1984 in America. 1984 is also the year, just on the sort of cultural front, like Michael Jordan enters the NBA, Oprah premieres, The Cosby Show premieres. I think a lot of it on the heels of Thriller and of what Michael Jackson did. American culture, sort of shifts into a different relationship to Black culture that creates other, possibilities for Prince as well. Coming up right behind that, and this will lead to our next conversation, 1984 is also the year that Run DMC's first album comes out, the first gold-selling hip-hop album, the first sort of real, hip-hop stars beyond just sort of one novelty hit at a time, and starts to then reinitiate this rift between pop culture and Black culture in certain ways. So, there's all of these things that are happening around what Prince, around that moment that Purple Rain comes out that, that just all seem to, when I wrote the Let's Go Crazy book, that actually started as I was thinking about writing a book about the summer of 1984. because of
Oh,
all of this stuff. And then I sort of thought,
sounds like you have
yeah,
another book
but
to write.
no, people have done since then, they've done 1984. But I realized that, enough of that really could be sort of isolated down to the Prince story and the Let's Go Crazy story that would get to the essence of a lot of what I was talking about, and also let me dive deeper into doing a Prince story. So that all sort of, it shows up in the book in different ways, but that wasn't the initial impulse. Was really about sort of American culture. It's as you remember well, it's Reagan's re-election year where he runs the table.
Yeah.
You know,
So it does sound like that in that answer is the uniquely American convergence of cultures in a country of immigrants creates a really forceful musical event. Well, moving to
yes, conveniently enough.
our fourth artist, Public Enemy, you highlight showed the possibilities and the limitations of activism in American music. Take it away, Alan Light.
So I was watching. Sorry, I was watching. I'm just trying to pull up the quote. An interview. Questlove has a new book that just came out called "Hip Hop Is History," um, and he was on. It was a clip from Morning Joe, I think, this morning, and the phrase that he used was, he said, that Public Enemy, was it opened my mind? That's what I was trying to say. But functionally, let's say that that's what he said. That Public Enemy was really the thing that expanded my mind, and Public Enemy were that experience, I think, for lots and lots of listeners. I was fortunate enough. We are fortunate enough that we grew up. We really did grow up as hip hop was growing up. I remember the first time that I heard Rapper's Delight in 1979 at a, I'll tell the story because I like the story. It was Martin Luther King Day, so I guess it was January 1980, and the jazz band from another school came to play at our school as part of a Martin Luther King Day celebration. Me and my friends ended up playing basketball with some of the guys from that visiting jazz band. They had brought on the bus, a boombox, and put on Rapper's Delight while we were playing. And it was the first time that I heard that and was like, what is that? And I remember it. I absolutely, like, that was a moment. Grew up in Cincinnati. This stuff took a minute to reach us, right? But we are of the age that we were able to grow up as this music was growing up and was becoming the predominant global pop culture. And and I was very lucky that I was really interested, following, listening closely to hip hop in the 80s. And when I first started working at Rolling Stone, um, I was, sort of speaking up for a lot of these hip hop groups, acts that there wasn't really anybody on staff that was sort of advocating for. It wasn't that Rolling Stone disapproved of hip hop. It was just sort of that staff. It wasn't what anybody was living and breathing. And I sort of made enough, good calls and said we should review this record or get this thing in that turned out to work, that became my beat at Rolling Stone. I got to do a lot of other things as well, but I got to, really in the late 80s, early 90s was sort of the hip hop desk at Rolling Stone, which is like being the jazz critic in the 40s or the rock and roll writer in 1964 or whatever it is, that I got to write about. Ice-T, LL Cool J, NWA, De La Soul, Eric B. and Rakim, this was what I was doing. And at that moment, Public Enemy were the most important musical artists in the world. And I got to do a lot of work with Public Enemy back then. And over a lot of time, I spent, as much, I mean, Ice-T and Chuck D are sort of the two guys that I have, maybe not now, but for a long time would say I spent the most time just with and talking to and thinking about and writing about. And the thing that sticks with me, again, to go back again to the Nina Simone thing and talk about an artist's role, Public Enemy took on as their mission this notion of, this is going to be about politics. I mean, this is, Questlove said this morning, he's like, it was the punk rock moment for hip hop that, it was the microphone, it was the megaphone for, an entirely different worldview than what was being represented anywhere else in any kind of mainstream culture. And, and so it was fascinating up close to watch Chuck wrestling with what does that mean and how do you do it and what do you do with that and what actually are the ambitions here. A line that always struck with me when I did a big piece at some point was he said, with Public Enemy, our goal is to create 5,000 Black leaders for the future, which is a really interesting way to frame. It wasn't about, I mean, they got involved in actual policy sorts of things, but I think that is both an insightful and ultimately sort of a productive way to think about what you can do with this stuff, which is just, we want to create possibility. That was the thing that was so exciting. The thing that was so exciting musically and, culturally and in every way about being in the middle of hip hop at that time was just this endless sense of nobody knows where this is going, which came down to like, I don't know what the next record is going to sound like. I don't know what the next 30 seconds in this song is going to sound like. There aren't any rules for doing this. To watch it create itself in that way was, incredibly exhilarating to just hang on and witness. And so there was a lot of awkward stuff. There was a lot of mistakes that Public Enemy made. Things that, again, group members said, do you kick somebody out for saying something offensive? Do you keep them in but try to educate them? Do you, what's the right way? And these are young, we were all so young. These are kids doing this. But when I think about Public Enemy, when I think about the impact of what that very politicized moment for hip hop was, that I was, fortunate enough to sort of be in the front row for, what I think about is this idea of potential and of just introducing so many ideas to listeners, bringing, just leaving names and references and breadcrumbs for them to follow and see what is it that people pick up on. And if they don't pick up on the specifics of that, do they just pick up on the idea of, oh, you can do that. You can create this stuff that opens up these ideas. So that's that's what I think about for these purposes, is this sort of transformative sense of culture and leadership. Because you can say, you can say it was a failure. You can say like there was the moment where hip hop, that was what it was about. And then it just got so big and it became super commercial and it became, the priorities were shifted away from that and kids didn't want to hear that stuff. And, first of all, hip hop is just inherently political by its existence and by who makes it and creates it. But second of all, I think that it's not about what legislation did those records lead to, but more about what did it create in those listeners to give them spaces to think about and aspire to.
Well, I just love your word in there, just possibility. And
that's the one that I stick on.
Explosive. That's our president's word, possibility for America.
Well, that's what I think of when I think of Public Enemy as the center, and they really were the leaders, but of that whole moment. And you just when you think about how where the culture was at that time. And that was the only place that there was access to mass communication from, you know, from young Black creators and voices, that it was really kind of stringing this network together of, there was the New York scene, and there was a little in Atlanta, a little in Houston, kind of, though nobody really paid that much attention. LA was its thing, but whatever. But as they started to talk to each other, as those dots started to be connected, I always go back to the night that the riots started in LA after the Rodney King verdict. George Bush got on television and said that this was a response, that people were so shocked by the verdict, and this was how their response. But the point wasn't that people were shocked by it. The point was that that community had learned to expect that. It was it validated everything that they suspected. But if you were not in that community, the only place you would have heard that was on hip hop records. You would not hear about that tension between, inner city Black youth and the police. That wasn't on. Dan Rather wasn't talking about that.
Yeah.
The newspapers weren't writing about that. You weren't seeing that addressed on TV dramas. That was the net. I mean, famously, Chuck D said that hip hop was Black America's CNN. And it's obviously he's really good at phrases, so it nails the thing. But it really was this, this sort of subcultural communication, or whatever you want to call it, this other network that, was simply not being exposed or being given any access anywhere else. That is no longer the world that we live in,
Yeah.
But it's no longer the world we live in as a large result because of the efforts of these artists.
Just listening to that description of not knowing even what the next 30 seconds of music would sound like, and that emphasis on possibility, just have to put in big plug for democracy here.
No,
I'm sort of a hopeless, not nationalist, but patriot, and a country that is founded very problematically, but on the idea of individual liberty and expression as a thread, and then the artistry of Public Enemy making that true forcefully is really inspiring to me.
And again, this just how thrilling hearing this music was. I mean, hearing these ideas and all of the stuff that was in there, but also just hearing these sounds. That summer, it was we graduated college in 1988. Right at that time, Public Enemy, It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back came out. Still, if I'm asked what the greatest hip hop record is and one of the greatest albums ever made, that is my answer. And the story is funny because a bunch of us drove across the country after we graduated. As you may recall, we all ended up on the West Coast together. We all, landed in the same place and hung out for a few weeks together, and I would have seen you then. But that hearing, that sound, just that crazy screech of that Public Enemy record in these, it was in every car that passed by in New York City, but then it was in every car that passed by in Berkeley, when we were there. And you didn't even have to hear the words. It was just like, what is it? What is that? It doesn't sound like anything. It doesn't sound, they made the record called Bring the Noise because people said, this isn't music. This is just noise. Like, that sounds terrible. Like, you know what? That's what we're doing. You notice it. That's what we're doing.
Oh, this is such a delight. We have today's biggest artist.
Yes, at your absolute insistence, but it didn't take much persuading.
I don't remember any such pressure. So Taylor Swift.
Yeah.
Our fifth and final lesson, proving that consensus is still in our grasp through authenticity and strategy. I first just want to say you're another big recommendation, everyone. Google Alan Light's Taylor Swift article. It's
Well,
just
there's a few of them.
pleasure.
There's some interviews over the years with her too. So
Right. Sorry, I pulled up the
the
Orchard Poets department. I'm going to
review,
dig back
yes.
through others, but just the world's most dominant cultural figure, 1 billion streams from this album,
Yes.
the most successful tour in history. And so I'm really interested in that, the authenticity and the strategy that you highlight.
So
Because
I've been,
It's not Prince genius.
no. I've been, again, fortunate enough that I've been able to do some work with Taylor over the years. I've interviewed her a few times. We've done a few things together. And the first time that I met her, I was in Nashville. I was covering the CMA Fest that year, and I was doing these video interviews for MSN. We were doing a thing at the time. And it was when the second album came out. It was when Fearless came out. And she was still 18 or 19. And met her then, and we did a little interview, and when we talked and we hung out, and it was immediately evident for this, teenage girl that everything was coming from her. That was the thing, and I'm not making this up in retrospect. This was what it was at the time. There was no sense of pageant girl. There was no sense of somebody is directing her, pulling her strings, telling her what to do, telling her what to say. She was very sharp, and she was funny, and she was sort of spontaneous, and just felt like this, really smart girl. But it was just clear that this was sort of just as that record was exploding and she was beginning this world, the world domination that followed. But really getting that sense of, oh my God, this is all about her. And that's the thing that I think she has really retained for the whole ride, that's so remarkable, and that she just doesn't get enough credit or recognition for. That she has the most uncanny, I don't even know what to say, like her sense of her relationship to her audience, what they want from her ability to anticipate what they're going to want from her, and to create this universe that you enter into as a Taylor fan that is its own world with all of its own, for better or worse, all of its own histories and backstories and, layers and lore and all of that stuff, but also just within the music. That's 100%. There's nobody else telling her what to do. And that's astounding. She is no one has done what Taylor is doing. No one has done this.
The scale of it is,
even if you hate the music, even if you don't care, whatever it is, nobody has been this big for this long and continuing to get bigger in history. Like, she is in uncharted waters at this point. I always say the Rolling Stones, no one's ever been a band for more than 60 years. So every day that the Rolling Stones wake up and they're still the Rolling Stones, they're somewhere nobody's ever been. There's no blueprint. There's no example. There's nothing to learn from. Taylor is now in that place where she's doing something no one has ever done before. So, the things that strike me about that are, you talk about this sense of American independence, this sense of it's your vision. I mean, she has a song that I love called "You're on Your Own, Kid." Like, in the end, live or die, thrive or not, that's coming straight from her, and that's what those kids are reacting to.
well, I wonder if would you draw from her just straight up lessons, back to your opening statement about the sort of ideals, the ambitions, the achievements of these 5 artists and what they could really teach us in this moment from Taylor Swift.
So it's really, it's very hard to gauge sort of, relative popularity. I don't think that because people are looking for what are the precedents for this. Like, there's Beatlemania, there's Thriller, there's a couple of things, but it's really hard to know. even just the math of it. I mean, we can see how many streams, but that's done a different way, because if somebody listens, if each Crazy Taylor fan is listening to the album 50 times over, that registers as 50 times, like that comes up numerically. So how big is it? Right? How big is it is baffling to really try to get under. There's no real way to argue against the ticket sales.
Yeah.
And the ability to create, we use the word consensus in the description. We live obviously in a world that is so fragmented, and that is so, everybody is on their own island. The algorithm is directing you to exactly the thing that is what you want to listen to, and not anything outside of that. I couldn't believe when, whenever it was 10 years ago that Adele put out an album that sold 10 million copies. At that point, I didn't think it was possible for anyone to do something that would sell 10 million copies. I just didn't think that there was that anybody would have a wide enough audience. To reach those numbers, you have to cross a bunch of demographics. You can't do 10 million just to one segment of the audience. To see that exploded to the scale, again, particularly that the tour and just the societal awareness of Taylor is something that I would have said is no longer possible in the world that in which we exist. What is it? Like, and what is it that she rings out and resonates, and it becomes that thing? And all I can come back to is that sense of that feeling of that one-to-one relationship that the audience has to her. That sense that as big and pop and glitzy and choreographed and everything else, it is the actual individual sort of beating heart of her that is what gets that reaction.
Well, I love this one lyric in your article. I go to secret gardens in my mind. People need a key to the only one is mine. And just that sense around this album, which is not strategic nor commercial in its intent, the Tortured Poets Department, but she needed it. Like, she needed, as you said, to clear the deck, but then also just to write all of that out.
But at the same time, the fact that it then did react the way that it did, and that people did respond. When it came up, people were like, 31 songs, what are you doing? Like, nobody has the patience for an album anymore, except when it's a Taylor or a Beyonce or an album that has this whole story and construct around it. But when she did the first half and then did the second half, the immediate like, everybody said, this is not going to work commercially. But she also knows, you know what? For a lot of my listeners, stand back and watch.
Well, I mean, I could delight in this again for hours with rapping on Taylor Swift and the America specific aspects of her, what made all of this possible for her besides her own drive and her own authenticity. It's something about the commercial opportunity in America, something about women's ability to just rock it if they fight for it here.
It's really interesting to look across pop music right now and say that overwhelmingly the biggest stars and the stars that people really actually care about are almost all women. That Taylor and Beyonce and Billie Eilish and Lana Del Rey and, we'll see Lady Gaga stays there. But there's a list. There really aren't any. I mean, The Weeknd is sort of his own kind of a thing, but it's hard to come up with male stars or bands or acts who are at that. I mean, Ed Sheeran, I guess, kind of, but I don't know that people care about him the way that they care about those other artists, right? About those women. They are above and beyond just people like the songs. They represent a thing. They stand there's an identification, right? There's a recognition, there's a mirror, there's a, something at a scale that, nobody ever would have seen even a few years ago, really. That's an interesting thing to think about. Like
Well, it's gonna be an interesting
that goes
time.
to sociology far beyond my academic capabilities.
Well, as a vote on the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame circuit, that'll be an interesting layer,
Oh,
for
when those guys come,
this
yeah,
class.
for sure. And what those legacies will look like, right? Taylor is where she is right now, and she's 33. And I just went to see, well, and today Paul McCartney turns 82 and is still filling stadiums. So when you say, like, what is she gonna be? I mean, not now there are those models. Said there wasn't a model for the Stones. Now there are those models for sustaining those careers for decades and decades. What are we talking about Taylor Swift 20, 30, 40 years from now? I mean, I don't know where she's going to be 20 months from now.
In our closing minutes, are there people who some honorable mentions for the five that are particularly significant in their America relevant?
Well, I mean, then it gets a little bit into scale and into, I mean, then you start talking about, there are certainly the kind of foundational figures. There isn't a jazz player who's here.
Mm-hmm.
And, do you want to call that Louis Armstrong, or do you want to call that Miles Davis?
Right.
How do you want to argue that?
I guess better question, less comprehensive would be, are there any new voices or artists that particularly grab you right now in this vein?
That's a very fair question. I don't know. There's smaller scale writers. There are people like a Jason Isbell who are writing really striking things one after another. There are I don't know. Again, because of that sense of fragmentation, because of that sense of who scales up to have the impact that these kinds of figures do.
Yeah.
On the one hand, there's a digital universe. We know there's good and bad things. Like there's great things about, and for you as well, on the democracy side, on the activist side, like for people that so many of the barriers to entry go away, right? That people can just make music and put it up on TikTok, and people can find it, and they can go be a musician, go be a professional musician. Those things that never existed. There was one way to put out music before. You had to do it, sell an album. Now you have a song, you do a song. You have 4 songs. If they're good songs, do 4 songs. Like whatever's right. You can, and all of that should be good for creativity. But it does make it does make it harder to then break through to, really capture the imagination in a lasting way, in a bigger way. Again, the things that Taylor is doing, that forget that I can't believe it because they're unprecedented. I also can't believe it because of the moment, and because of for all the lack of consensus, for all the lack of commonality that torments, your world, and thinking about democracy, and thinking about misinformation, and thinking about, everything else that's out there, that an artist could be embraced and could have an impact at that, this mass level. That's pretty unbelievable.
Well, I want to just out to the audience right now. We are, I think, really good at setting up amazing people we admire, like Alan Light, for these essential lessons on America. We're not amazing at promoting them well in advance. So this recording will be up at my5things.com/America. And we'll be putting it out on Substack, and hope that anyone who really enjoyed hearing Alan's views on these 5 giants in American music tonight will help it reach more ears and more American votes too, because I think we wouldn't find many giants coming out of the autocratic regimes around the world in this fashion. So, Alan, Sound Up is your new podcast. I think
Yes.
we'll send around links to the Sound Up podcast and then to Alan's books for everyone's enjoyment. And then I don't know if you have any closing words on your.
Now, Sound Up with my co-host Mark Goodman and we do twice a week and can be found wherever podcasts are found. So please feel free to drop by and check that out. And I have no parting words of wisdom here for you, Megan. I don't know what.
No, that was.
I hope that all of that is the sort of territory that you wanted to address here. But I think I think where our worlds meet and align, I think returning to some of these notions of possibility, an overused word of empathy, but what these artists exemplify, the boundless, I don't even want to say ambition, again, possibility, but creative possibility that somebody like Prince represents, the ability to, again, create a world that's all about your creating. That's the sort of vision that moves things, in my world and in your world, and creating and following the lessons, the examples that these guys set. I think just rings out a lot bigger than just what the songs sound like.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you everyone who's here tonight and My5 Things and Resolute Square. And enjoy the rest of your evening, friend.
Thank you so much. I hope I'll see you soon, one coast or the other.
Yep.
And keep fighting the fight.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay.